My name is Erin Lasley. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Hey friends, how's it going out there? Is everyone, ready for spring? So I took a very long break, more than 2 months. Y'all, seasonal depression, it's no joke. Normally, the Pacific Northwest winters, they don't really affect me that much because it also coincides with my busy time at work. I'm simply, too distracted to notice the gloomy weather, and I enjoy wrapping myself in a big, fluffy blanket and hoodies and cuddling with my pups. But this year it was different. I don't know what happened, but suddenly the only thing I wanted to do is burrito myself in a blanket and nap through episodes of Midsummer Murders. It even impacted my job. I'm talking about a months-long episode of Writer's Block, which nearly devastated my big annual project. I stressed about my job. I stressed about my deadline. I stressed about not getting a podcast episode out. There was just too much stress, which just fueled my depression, which just fueled my stress, and it was just a vicious circle. I was spending my weekends. I was gorging on Little Debbie snacks and napping constantly. On the outside, I looked fine, I acted fine, but on the inside, I was blah. I mean, my apartment looked like a trash heap. At least it didn't smell one, which I'm so thankful for Glade plugins. So what to do? Get rid of the stress, obviously, or at least manage it. I intentionally put the podcast to the side because you all deserved better than, a half-assed podcast. I would rather it be late than bad. And I know I may have disappointed a few of you, and I know I lost some listeners, but I did not want to produce a bad product. It was the same for work. And fortunately, I have an awesome and understanding boss who saw me struggling. And he would rather me submit a late product than something that would have to be fixed later on. And then suddenly, my writer's block disappeared. After I took all that stress off my shoulders, it was magic. My writing was a little off, but the ideas were finally flowing enough I get thoughts on paper and develop a narrative slowly. Then they all came rushing back. It was like a dam bursting, the rains after severe drought. My joy for writing and creating history returned. The creativity, it was so profound that I not only met my deadline, but I did it a day early. That same day, I received another piece of extraordinary news that I'll share with you at a later date. But it propelled me into the stratosphere. It inspired me to sit down and finish up this episode that I actually began months ago. I have a big stupid grin on my face right now. I can't stop laughing. Not only because I am back with you, but also because my apartment's clean. The dryer's broken, but everything else is sparkling. Except for my bedroom because, I had to throw those clothes that were on the dryer someplace. And, so they're all piled in my bedroom right now. I recognize that My episode of seasonal depression, it wasn't severe, but it was heading that way. A few more weeks and I knew I would have to see a doctor. Depression, it's no joke. Every day it gets more and more difficult to get out of bed. Care about the things you normally enjoy and to take care of yourself. It's difficult to snap out of it because your brain is practically lying to you because it's thrown chemical production out of whack, and it just makes life seem bleak. But life is not bleak. It's not always sunshine and roses, but there's always hope. If you feel the least bit depressed, don't let it spiral out of control. Get help now. Talk to your doctor. There's no shame in it at all. It's just a testament to your strength and your resiliency. If you've reached the point where you're contemplating suicide, please call 988 if you're in the United States. If you're in the UK, please call 0800 689 5652. There are people out there who want to help. You are not alone. By now, all of you know that I am a historian for the military. For the sake of compartmentalizing my career and my podcasting, I've never disclosed which branch I work for. But I can say that large global events heavily impact where I work. I constantly watch the news because it will help me predict if my unit will be busy or not, and also gives me a heads up before we get busy. Obviously, back in October, we got busy pretty quick after Hamas attacked Israel, and I had to check myself. To properly do my job, I have to check my personal opinions and biases. I have to rely on fact to appropriately document history, and that is so difficult because I think most of us have strong opinions on Israel and Palestine. I am not going to get into those opinions today. We are going to talk about history today and the events that led to the massacre at the Munich Olympics in 1972. And mind you, I've had this episode planned on my calendar since well before this past October. Before we get into that, I just want to remind you that I'm human. Sometimes my biases surface despite my attempts to clamp down on them. That bias, though, concerns only events I am going to talk about in this episode. They do not pertain to current events. My only wish for what is going on right now is for the safe return of hostages, the safety of innocent people, especially children, and peace. My only agenda with this episode is to demonstrate turbulent relations between Israel and Palestine have been going on for decades, and they are far more complicated than any news story or social media post can do justice to. They are far more complicated than I can possibly explain. As you listen to this episode, I strongly urge you to conduct your own research, and I'm not talking about jumping onto your favorite left or right wing website or social media page. I'm talking about good research with good sources. Finally, at no time will you hear me blame one religion or another because religion is never to blame. Only people are. From my studies and my experiences, it is people who use religion to justify violence. There are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world who practice their religion peacefully. There are 15.7 million Jews in the world who practice their religion peacefully. This episode is not about them. This episode is about extremists who misuse and misinterpret religious texts and bastardize religion. If at any moment you believe my historical research is wrong, I encourage you to reach out to me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or message me on Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. When I originally wrote this, I only believed I would be doing this in one episode, but this is going to be a two-parter. So we'll get into extremism in the second episode. This is one of those episodes where I didn't know when to start, historically speaking. When it comes to history of Israel and Palestine, do you start all the way back in the BC, or do we start relatively recently? I thought we'd start around the 20th century just for the sake of time. In the late 1800s, there was a movement called Zionism to create a homeland for Jews, because Jews were persecuted in, well, pretty much in all of Europe, and it made sense to them and others that Jews should have their own homeland, and that homeland should be in Palestine. The only problem was there were already a lot of people living in Palestine, and while most of them didn't have a personal beef against Jews, they didn't like the idea of their homeland turned into a Jewish homeland. The first Zionist migration in the modern era occurred in 1882, when approximately 35,000 Jews traveled from Russia and Romania into Palestine, which at the time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. This was known as the First Aliyah, and roughly coincided with the end of the Russian pogroms. And to be honest, I don't blame them for wanting to leave the Russian Empire. The pogroms, they were horrible and they were violent. The Russian Empire pretty much sanctioned an open hunting season on Russian Jews and their homes, businesses, and temples. Thousands of Jews were killed, and it sparked a mass migration from Russia to not only Palestine, but to the United States, Great Britain, and other Eastern European countries. Side note, if, by chance, you want to learn more about this migration but you have kids, I recommend watching An American Tale, a wonderful cartoon about the Mousekewitz, they're mice, who were run out of their Russian home by anti-Semitic cats and traveled to the United States to start a new life. I was, I think, around 4 when I first watched it, and I had no idea what was going on. Decades later, I watched it again with my niece and bowled through the entire movie while she giggled at Feifel's funny antics. The poor thing got an unwanted history lesson from Aunt Erin that day, but she survived and she got to watch the sequel, An American Tale, Feifel Goes West. In the early 1900s, another set of pogroms occurred yet again in Russia, and another estimated 40,000 Jews traveled from Russia, other Eastern European countries, and some South American countries to Palestine. This was the second Aliyah. This wave created groups to protect Jewish settlers from Arab aggressions and helped revive Hebrew within the region. However, many of these settlers left when World War I started. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire pretty much got its ass kicked, and it ceased to exist. Much of its territory, other than Turkey, fell into the hands of the British and gave new hope to Zionists who, once again, flooded into Palestine during the Third Aliyah. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour wrote a letter to Baron Rothschild, who was a wealthy and prominent leader in the British Jewish community. In the brief correspondence, Balfour expressed the British government's support for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. This letter, which would later become extremely important, was published in the press 1 week later and eventually became known as the Balfour Declaration. The text was included in the Mandate for Palestine, a document issued by the League of Nations in 1923 that gave Great Britain the responsibility of establishing a Jewish national homeland in British-controlled Palestine. Jews celebrated because after 2,000 years, it looked like they were going to be given back their ancestral homeland, at the expense of the Palestinians who had lived in Palestine for 2,000 years and also considered the land their ancestral home. Between 1924 and 1929, during the Fourth Aliyah, some 82,000 Jews traveled from Poland and other areas to Palestine. Some of them would have been more than happy to live in the United States, but the US government closed its doors to Jews because of, quotas. Though the League of Nations mandated a Jewish national homeland, there really wasn't a set time frame for the creation, and the British were, they were a bit busy trying to organize their new territories and exploit those resources. It was a, we'll get to it when we get to it. Enter Hitler. When the Nazi Party came to power in Germany in the 1930s, their first act of business wasn't to kill European Jews, but just encourage them to leave. And many did. During the Fifth Aliyah, more than 250,000 European Jews escaped Germany and other European countries into Palestine. More than 150,000 of them were considered illegal immigrants because the British tried to put a halt to the mass wave of immigration into Palestine. Why? It was getting hairy. Palestinians were getting tired of being squeezed out of their homes and businesses and were attacking Jewish immigrants, and, Jewish immigrants were fighting back. Both groups attacked the British for not doing enough to keep the peace. Then came the Holocaust and the deaths of 6 million European Jews. Clearly, the mass slaughter brutally slapped the world to its senses. The world has spent centuries persecuting Jews, and many people, including many Americans, were anti-Semitic. But the Holocaust forced people to recognize how stereotypes and conspiracy theories and hate could cause catastrophic tragedy. In response to the Holocaust, the newly formed United Nations granted Jews their own homeland in 1947 by splitting Palestine into 2 states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. Unfortunately, this wasn't a happily ever after ending. In fact, things were just starting to heat up. I think if you study history, you already know that. When the UN announced its partition plan in 1947, violence broke out, again, between Palestinians and Jews. And when Israel proclaimed the creation of Israel in May 1948, Arab nations, including Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Yemen, and even Saudi Arabia, attacked the new country. By the time war ended, or at least cooled down, Palestinians were worse off since Israel amassed more territory than it did under the original UN mandate. Fast forward to 1967 and the Six-Day War. Now, I'm not saying nothing happened in those 20 years between wars, but for the sake of time, we're just skipping ahead a little bit. War waged again between Israel and Arab countries, including Egypt and Syria, and this time, Israel put the hurt on Egypt. Not only did Israel destroy most of Egypt's military airfields, but it seized the Sinai Peninsula along with the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. And it took control of the city of Jerusalem. This is where our story starts. Lots of Arab countries antagonizing and attacking Israel, Israel seizing more and more land until Palestine was gone, and Palestinians whose homes were being taken away and forced to flee to neighboring countries or pack themselves into Gaza or the West Bank. To say the least, it was chaos. On one side were people trying to carve out a new homeland and protect themselves against a world that had persecuted them for thousands of years. And on the other side were people protecting their homes where they had lived for thousands of years. It's not surprising. It's not surprising violence would break out and leak out into other arenas, specifically the Olympic Arena in 1972. But we'll explore that story in the next episode. In most episodes, I talk about a cold or missing persons case. Many of these cases involve children and people that are just like you and me. Anyone can be a victim of crime, even those who protect us from monsters. Jason Ellis joined the Bardstown, Kentucky Police Department in 2006 and in 2008 was awarded Officer of the Year. He was a husband, a father to two boys, a canine cop, and he is a murder victim. During the early morning hours of May 25th, 2013, Jason signed off for the night and was headed home. While driving down the Bluegrass Parkway, he took exit 34 and stopped when he spotted several branches blocking the road. Ever vigilant, he maneuvered his patrol car to block the exit to prevent other drivers from driving into the debris and got out to remove the tree limbs. As he was cleaning up the debris, someone shot Jason several times with a 12-gauge shotgun. Just a few minutes after the shooting, two passerbys stopped to assist Jason. One attempted to render aid, and another called for help on Jason's radio, but Jason died on the scene. No one has been apprehended in Jason's case, and his murder remains unsolved. It is possible Jason's murder is connected to the double homicide of Kathy and Samantha Netherland on April 22, 2014. In 2014, the brutal double homicide of 48-year-old Kathy Netherland and her 16-year-old daughter Samantha rocked the town of Bardstown, Kentucky. Their bodies were discovered by Kathy's father on April 22nd after she failed to show up for work at Bardstown Elementary School, where she worked as a special education teacher. According to death certificates, Kathy had been shot multiple times, and Samantha had been bludgeoned to death. Both had sustained knife wounds to their necks. Their murders also remain unsolved. The FBI is offering a reward of up to $50,000 for any information relating to an arrest for Jason's case. If you have any information, please contact 1-800-CALL-FBI. There is a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest in Kathy and Samantha's case. If you have any information, you can contact the Kentucky State Police at 270-766-5078. If you feel uncomfortable going to the police, you can reach out directly to me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or on Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. Someone out there knows something. You may not, but you may know people in Kentucky who do. Share Jason, Kathy, and Samantha's stories with them. So, an interesting thing happened to me last week. I was killing time before I met a good friend for lunch and decided to go to a bookstore, which is not all that surprising if you know me. As I was walking out, I noticed a man wearing a motorcycle vest with, he had lots of patches on it. And I introduced myself as a podcaster and a historian who recently did an episode about biker gangs, and I asked if I could check out his patches. He was very polite and he was enthusiastic, and he was talking about how he got into motorcycles while I was looking at his patches. And the first one I saw was the One Percenters patch, then the SS Lightning Bolts, and then I noticed the Banditos patch. This dude was the real deal, and he didn't mind answering any of my questions. In fact, he was very forthcoming, telling me about his criminal past, his old lady standing in the club, and the time he met Sonny Barger. He he actually had pictures of him with Sonny Barger on his phone, and he told me how the Banditos nearly kicked his ass over that event. At the end of our conversation, he even invited me. This is crazy. He even invited me to ride with them if I wanted to get more information about the club, which I politely declined, but it was kind of wild that I was invited to ride with an outlaw motorcycle gang. It's scary to think about, but it was wild nonetheless. Trust me, I will not be jumping on the back of a motorcycle anytime soon, but it was just an interesting story about how this podcast has made, well, my life more interesting. So while I will not be, riding a motorcycle, I will be, on the other hand, producing as many new episodes as I can before the summer. I really want to thank all the people who reached out to check on me during my time of silence. Your thoughts and your well wishes, they really boosted me up. And, well, they really did me some good. And I love hearing from you all. I enjoy your stories and even your constructive critiques on the podcast. Please keep those emails coming. You can email me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com and follow the podcast on Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. I hope to see you all real soon. Until then, do me a favor. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Later.